Star Wars has always been political, to put it lightly, but there's also always been a narrative tension in Star Wars between its politics and its themes. Until Andor.
Dome Runners TV, your guide to the Underhive and beyond.
Spoiler alert. Greetings, scabby scummers and gangers. I am Crimson Oracle, and today we are going to step out of my usual focus on the Warhammer universe to talk Star Wars. This will probably be the first of many excursions into the world of a long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. With a new Star Wars skirmish game coming in 2023, not to mention a new season of Bad Batch and Mandalorian, I'm going to have a lot of Star Wars stuff to talk about. But those are topics for other days. Today we're going to be talking about the latest Disney Plus show, which, while well received overall, has proved a bit polarizing with some. I just finished Andor and I have a lot of thoughts on it, and I wanted to get a jump on expressing them before I started watching everyone else's videos about it, as I didn't want to just repackage other people's ideas. Any overlap here is purely the result of parallel thinking. I'm looking forward to experiencing everyone's thoughts now that the video is finally in the can. Specifically, I want to get into why Andor feels so different from other Star Wars media, even the superficially similar Rebels. Please note that I say different, not better. I'm not here to tell you what kind of storytelling is objectively superior, as it's just not possible. But I think I can articulate why Andor feels so fundamentally different from Star Wars as we know it. But to get there, we have to start way, way back with George Lucas.
If you like the show, like and subscribe, and don't forget to check us out on Patreon. For $2 a month you can help support the show.
So, to pinpoint what makes Andor feel so different from other Star Wars, we have to start with the original film's genesis. Star Wars started its life as a treatment for a pulp sci-fi film in the tradition of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. A dense and incoherent mess, the script would go through an extended process of rewrites, dropping a lot of the most esoteric and convoluted elements. The story evolved from a focus on Jedi as the supplanted personal guard of the king to one centered on a fallen republic turned into the first galactic empire. This shift took the movie in a direction of a story of resistance against a vast and powerful empire. As Lucas put it recently to James Cameron,
you know, we're fighting the largest empire in the world.
Right.
And we're just a bunch of hayseeds in coonskin hats who don't know nothing.
While any story about war exists in the realm of politics by definition, this shift took Star Wars from backward-looking romantic themes and nostalgia to embrace a modern, anti-imperialist politics, something as relevant today as it was in 1976. The former democracy cum empire is reflective of the feelings of many at the time that the US had become the very faceless evil that the American Revolution had conceptually resisted in the first place. Note, this is in part informed by myths about America's founding. A more accurate reading finds that America's democratic ideals were always more rhetorical than literal, but that's a topic for a whole other video. The connection to Vietnam is something Lucas has discussed extensively, for example in 2005 to the Chicago Tribune while promoting Revenge of the Sith. It was really about the Vietnam War, and that was the period where Nixon was trying to run for a second term, which got me to thinking historically about how do democracies get turned into dictatorships, because the democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away.
I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Exactly.
But a polemic Star Wars is not. The wide number of fans who express shock at Star Wars dealing in politics despite its subject matter is proof of this. In fact, the politics of the series serve as a backdrop, the context that the characters move through. Luke longs to join the rebellion, but we don't really know why, what the Empire is to him. He even talks about joining the Academy earlier in the film, which would have put him on the path to serving the Empire rather than fighting against it. Note, joining the Academy was probably also the only way to get the flight skills he needed to become either a commercial pilot or someone capable of fighting the Empire in the cockpit, so much like his friend Wedge Antilles, Luke may have been intending to receive training and then defect. We don't know. Rather than an ideologue, Luke is an embodiment of an entirely different archetype, one Lucas very consciously drew upon as he fleshed out Luke's character. But to understand that, we have to talk a little bit about a guy named Carl Jung. Carl Jung is a complicated topic. An early academic psychologist, he was noticed by Sigmund Freud, and for a time the two were collaborators. But while Freud was the older pioneer, Jung couldn't reconcile his own ideas with Freud's, and as a result, a schism would form between the two. A central component of this conflict revolves around the idea of the unconscious. For Freud, unconscious thought was a place of repressed thoughts and feelings, a place the mind would put concepts it couldn't or didn't want to acknowledge. Jung thought of the unconscious as much more complicated, and believed that it contained inherited knowledge from ancestors called the collective unconscious. Jung's writing is notoriously florid, verging on poetic, making it hard to nail down exactly how literally to take this assertion. Interpretations vary from Jung simply meaning that our basic development lends itself towards a specific kind of storytelling that is in essence coded into our DNA, while others take this further and assert some kind of mystical collective intelligence that's completely without scientific basis, but a fascinating topic for discussion. The collective unconscious grew out of a phenomenon Jung noticed while he was studying religious and cultural myths. He noticed repeating themes and archetypes across the myths that he studied and set about naming them. This framework would form an important component of his analytical psychological framework, serving as metaphors to relate individual challenges to and development to. This would also become a major component of Jung's academic legacy, influencing, not necessarily for the better, literary analysis, psychology, and anthropology. Let's just get it out there. Jung had a lot of flawed, racist ideas, and that's not uncommon for people from that era. And we should be skeptical of their work when it comes to dealing with other cultures for that reason. Scholars of literature in particular found resonance with Jung's ideas as the archetypes offered a compelling tool for analyzing written works. This work is not necessarily of a particularly objective background, and indeed wildly different interpretations could be read using the same framework from the same text. But in the world of academic literature, that was more of a feature than a bug. One particular literary scholar who focused on comparative religion and mythology is Joseph Campbell. Campbell expounded on Jung's ideas to define what he would call the monomyth, a term he borrowed from James Joyce. The monomyth was a distillation of overlapping themes and archetypes within mythology that Campbell believed to be universal. In his book Hero with a Thousand Faces, Campbell describes what should be a familiar format. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Campbell defines 17 particular stages of the myth. Just to quickly summarize, the 17 stages, as you see here, can be split into 3 broad categories: the departure, initiation, and return. The story begins with a normal person who's called to embark on the journey and reluctantly goes. They face challenges and are changed by the experience. They return to their home a different person. You'll notice this naturally fits the 3-act structure common to film and theater. These steps can each be examined in great detail, and I'll link to an excellent video that explains the way Star Wars specifically fits the hero journey in the show notes, but keep in mind that these are broad categories and stories often fit them metaphorically rather than literally. For example, the woman as temptress step isn't necessarily a woman at all. It's more the concept of temptation of some sort. That kind of open interpretation is what makes this format fit across cultures so well, which is one of many criticisms of this overall analysis. Campbell was, after all, writing 70 years ago about other cultures he didn't necessarily fully understand, so please don't overread this work to be more than simply a subjective observation by one person that frankly doesn't hold up that well to intense scrutiny. But regardless of the accuracy of the monomyth as a global phenomena, the structure is useful for storytellers. George Lucas would pick up his copy of Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces while working on his 3rd draft of Star Wars, having previously read it in college. This would give him the structure to fit the world he was imagining around, giving the script a coherence previous drafts had lacked. This embrace of mythological storytelling gave Star Wars a universal quality that would certainly play a part in it becoming the highest grossing film at the time of its release. It did, however, create something of an internal contradiction within the story. Star Wars is a tale of revolution and democratic uprising against authoritarianism, but it focuses on a small group of individuals who seemingly win the war themselves. The mythological story reinforces the old framework of the great men of history, the idea that extraordinary individuals drive historical change. I went ahead and threw a link to an excellent Jack Saint video about this topic if you want to delve more into it. The truth is obviously far more complicated, with change primarily being driven by large-scale social phenomena. There are larger-than-life characters, certainly, but often their role is exaggerated and their personal contribution misunderstood. In essence, the old way of reading history is, in and of itself, a form of mythology, a way of understanding phenomena too complex to comprehend at the time that it was written. Basically, Star Wars grounds itself in a revolutionary context, but it has a backward central theme that limits how accurate the revolution seems in its depiction. I'll go so far as to suggest that while this format is not realistic, and I don't think many would claim mythic storytelling is intended to be realistic, it is evocative. Star Wars plays on the imagination of the viewer. Luke's journey is relatable to anyone who felt powerless to change a system. As Luke himself says in the film,
I can't get involved. I've got work to do. It's not that I like the Empire, I hate it, but there's nothing I can do about it right now. It's all such a long way from here.
It inspires them to aspire to participate in collective struggle against oppression. I can't say for certain that Star Wars was responsible for a generational shift in favor of liberatory struggle, but it is an early influence in the formation of many young people's ideas of right and wrong, and I think that's largely a good thing. Lucas took the old mythology and repurposed it to convey the values that he held, imparting them onto future generations. As Lucas put it to the Boston Globe in 2005, I love history, so while the psychological basis of Star Wars is mythological, the political and social bases are historical. Who knew Star Wars was so consciously dialectical, right? But while Star Wars does a masterful job of synthesizing these concepts, it has created something of a problem for the series as it has gone on. After the completion of the original trilogy and the fulfillment of Luke's original arc, Star Wars would take on a new life, first in the form of the extended universe of licensed stories in book, comic, and video game format, and then with Lucas's second trilogy of prequels. And consistently across these works, there's a tendency to focus on Luke, Leia, and their families. It's not universally true. There are excellent anthologies dealing with side characters and background locations that expand the scope of the universe, and the Old Republic setting is its own whole world thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin, but overall there is an excessive focus on one specific family. The prequels go so far as to show Luke and Leia's father's instrumental role in starting and ending the Clone Wars, as well as ending the Jedi Order. It also presents Sheev Palpatine as a master manipulator, successfully crafting decades of schemes to bring himself to power, including creating an army of pliable soldiers he could ensure would execute his plan to eradicate the Jedi. While there was a lot of great storytelling and interesting moments in these works, the continued central focus on a small number of figures determining the outcomes of historical trends was a bit much. This created what some have dubbed the Skywalker problem, the issue that Star Wars has far too closely focused on the Skywalker saga at the expense of the vast, near-limitless galaxy the story takes place in. Myths are evocative, but the longer you dwell on them, the more the artifice of the format shows through. The Skywalker problem continued even through the sequel trilogy. While it was fun to have cameos from the old cast, the series sought to swap in a new hero and play out the same journey, and even forced in that she was the granddaughter of Palpatine, continuing the series' issue with its inability to move beyond the same small group of characters and their descendants. Only Rian Johnson's Last Jedi seemed to try to move away from this concept, showing Luke rejecting his heroic obligations and ending with the image of Little Stablehand using the Force, emphasizing the idea that killing the leaders of a movement, crippling its ability to fight, is ultimately futile as the Empire continues to sow the seeds of its own destruction by alienating the masses. Even still, The Last Jedi goes out of its way to keep Leia alive and have Luke make a heroic sacrifice that saves the day in the end, so it still had a foot solidly planted in the Skywalker problem. There are some standout stories that do try to get away from the Skywalker family. The Mandalore arc in Clone Wars gives us a glimpse of a world outside of the Republic dealing with the consequences of the war the Jedi were prosecuting. The sister show to Clone Wars Rebels gets even further out from the Skywalker problem. Yes, cat. Come here. You get to be on camera. Okay, the morality of how one struggles against oppression. What kind of oppression do you have to deal with? Rebels is, I would say, philosophically the closest of the recent Star Wars stories to Andor, dealing with more of the mundane realities of resisting under a fascist government. But fundamentally, the story still repeats the hero's journey of previous Star Wars stories, focusing on Ezra Bridger instead of a Skywalker, but ultimately following familiar beats. It's simultaneously some of the most interesting Star Wars, particularly as we get to see Saw Gerrera's exploits resisting the Empire, bringing up the issue of diversity of tactics and the morality of how one struggles against oppression. Note, this is a video topic unto itself, and one I'm sure others have tackled, but I want to get into it at some point as well. And at the same time, it still feels a bit samey. Rogue One showed the most promise of the Disney Star Wars stories in moving past nostalgia and cyclical storytelling. While it still conforms to the setup of the hero's journey, it is ultimately much more concerned with the importance of individual sacrifice. The characters in Rogue One are on the whole not remarkable in and of themselves. Jyn is no great pilot, not a Jedi or a computer genius or anything else. She's someone who shows up and gives it all to the cause because ultimately she wants to make a better galaxy possible, even if she doesn't get to live in it. Cassian Andor is even more interesting. A complex and conflicted character, he's suspicious of the newcomer's commitment to the revolution, and at the same time torn about the morality of some of the things that he's had to do in the service of his mission. In the end, the contribution of the crew of Rogue One is a footnote in the main trilogy, setting up the retrieval of the Death Star plans by Princess Leia. Rather than epic heroes, they're martyrs. The film never achieved the reach of the main trilogies, but it earned itself a devoted following due to the refreshing new themes that it tackled. It should be no surprise then that one of the screenwriters of Rogue One would go on to bring us Andor, a Star Wars series of an entirely different nature. So finally we get to Andor. I've heard repeatedly from some viewers that Andor is too slow, that much of the first 3 episodes is unnecessary. I think the fact that the show's structure and subject matter are so distinct from other Star Wars stories creates a problem of expectation. The viewer who is expecting something that fits the Star Wars formula wonders why the story isn't advancing. This isn't a wrong conclusion, but I think it's missing part of what makes Andor great. The story of Andor isn't primarily about Cassian. Sure, he's important, of course, but the true story of Season 1 of Andor is the story of Ferrix, of the conditions there, of Narkina 5's prison factory, of the Imperial Security Bureau and their role in the galaxy. Cassian is the main subject, but the story is much more about systems than individuals. Cassian is there for us to have a view into how all of these different systems operate and interact, to make Star Wars feel real, essentially. Andor grounds itself in what Marxists refer to as base and superstructure. In classical Marxism, base and superstructure is a dichotomy between the base, which is to say the means of production, the land, tools, raw materials, etc., and relationship of individuals to the means of production, who owns what, how production is distributed, how wealth is distributed, etc., as opposed to the superstructure, the social phenomena like family, religion, politics, philosophy, law, etc. These two interact with each other and influence each other. There's debate about the applicability of this model in actual political science, but it does prove to be a good model for examining a fictional system. The show opens with 2 stories intercut. The childhood experience of Cassian as an indigenous survivor of what is indicated was either an accidental or intentional genocide. One, we should add, which appears to have started under the Old Republic's auspices. Cassian's planet is being strip-mined. The Republic before Sidious took power as Chancellor was allowing unfettered environmental devastation to occur on this world, likely for the profit of some corporation. In other words, the so-called democratic and sentient rights-focused republic with its high-minded Jedi defenders was, in fact, decaying into what would become the Empire already. Sidious is, in essence, just the inheritor of historical inevitability. The base, the material productive forces, and their owners, is influencing the superstructure, the Republic's delicate legal balance, which would sooner or later tip into civil war between the ownership classes. Of course, this also grounds Cassian's worldview. His devotion to his adoptive mother and anti-authority streak come from having been raised by a resistor, the superstructure of family and culture setting him up for a conflict against the broader shift from Republic to Empire. The main story shows Cassian's life falling apart after one bad night on a neighboring world. He isn't an ideologue, despite his mother's beliefs. Rather, he's looking for his sister, hoping she survived the disaster on Kenari. He kills 2 security guards working for the private corporation that controls the settlement, Preox Marlana. These aren't police or military, but they have the authority to act and impose on anyone in the settlement violence, imprisonment, and financial punishment. We're seeing up close and in detail the way the Empire interacted with private corporations, keeping a laissez-faire attitude towards how they operate as long as there wasn't a disruption in their operations. Corporate authority so similarly resembles authoritarian authority as to be nearly indistinguishable, something philosopher Elizabeth Anderson explains in detail in her book Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. Her premise is that while people tend to be weary of government authority, the modern corporation bears all the hallmarks of an authoritarian system, a dictatorship ruled over by a central authority that polices the appearance, speech, and behavior of employees, with coercive power originating from controlling the means of production. While Morlana is under direct corporate dictatorship, the nearby world of Ferrix is under corporate neglect. While Preox Morlana ostensibly controls Ferrix, the society there is mostly left to govern itself. Ferrix is essentially a giant scrapyard of old ships, with salvage operations seemingly the largest industry on the world. Act 1 of Andor takes us up close into the means of production, from Bix's family ownership over a vast scrapyard, her side operation as a black market smuggler, to the many laborers Cassian knows and interacts with. We see in Ferrix both the economic base and the cultural superstructure of this world, one governed mostly by local mores and civil society than the larger corporate authority or imperial laws and culture. Cassian upsets this delicate balance by inspiring the corporate authority to come to Ferrix and impose their laws and culture on the defiant citizens. Through the eyes of Cyril Karn, we see the corporate authority's reflexive instinct to favor a resolution of conflict in a way that doesn't attract the attention of the Imperials. It correctly understands that its existence is in tension with the Empire, serving a purpose, but ultimately disposable. Andor spends its first act taking a good hard look at life in the outskirts of the Empire, the poverty and economic inequality, the conflict between labor and authority. Ultimately, the people of Ferrix see Preox Marlana replaced with direct authority from the Empire. Why pay for a revolution on the installment plan when you can steal one? The second act of Andor is again split between stories, this time between Cassian's time as a mercenary with the rebellion, the machinations of the rebellion's leadership, and the aftermath of the Ferrix incident on the authorities. This act of the show is essentially a heist film. We watch as a group of brave or perhaps foolish burglars plot to steal vast wealth out from under the Empire. They are 7 against a garrison of 40. The team is an interesting mix of types. There's the young idealist Nemec, the older, more jaded idealist Vel Sartha from a wealthy family, Taraman Barcona, a former stormtrooper and defector, the former criminal turned revolutionary Skeen, the true believer Kaz, and the double agent Lieutenant Gorn. The team's mixed backgrounds are actually a really interesting inclusion in the story, particularly Cassian and Skeen, as Andor seems to have an appreciation for the fact that some of the best equipped individuals to operate in revolutionary action are actually criminals themselves. In fact, the show treads lightly into illegalism here, an individualist anarchist tendency that essentially holds that because society is based on violence and compulsion, that the act of rebelling against laws is an inherently revolutionary act, that crime is a priori revolutionary. Cassian doesn't believe in the cause. He's sympathetic, but thinks the rebellion is ultimately hopeless. He's willing to risk near certain failure and death with the hopes that what he gains can help him survive. Survival in the face of oppressive systems, in spite of them, is revolutionary. Skeen seems even further down this rabbit hole. We don't get to know whether anything he said about his background was true, but we do know that he's a criminal and that he hates the Empire. When he suggests to Cassian that they split the score and flee, Skeen reveals himself to be concerned primarily with continuing living as an active individual resistance, rather than believing in the greater collective action of Luthien or the rest of the rebellion. The Idealists are another interesting inclusion in the story. In Nemec, you have a sort of prototypical intellectual thrust into the world of action. He's someone who could have had a successful career, lived a comfortable life based on his skills as a navigator. But because of his moral outrage at the Empire, he found himself using his skills to resist instead. It's not entirely clear what drove Vel to the revolution, but as the cousin of a Sandrillan senator, she seems to have come from a background of wealth and privilege. Eschewing that for a life of hard work, resisting the Empire is a major commitment, but she seems to be a true believer, albeit one who's seen a lot more of the cruelty in life than the younger Nemec. These sorts of individuals are part of every revolutionary movement. For example, George Orwell was the scion of a successful family and author when he packed up his life and moved to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War against the fascists, attempting to seize the government there. He was motivated primarily out of a hatred of fascists, but, as he would later say, also out of a sense of decency. The Russian Marxist Leon Trotsky was similarly the child of a wealthy family who embraced radical ideas, fought for them, and was imprisoned and punished for them, but continued to fight until his revolution became possible. This goes back to the theme that authoritarianism sows the seeds of its own destruction, that even the children of the wealthy and privileged can see the hypocrisy and cruelty inherent in the actions of the government that elevates them over the masses, and seek to resist it. Barcona and Gorn are interesting because the theme of fascist systems not being sustainable once again comes to the surface. A soldier like Barcona, who defects after seeing the consequences of their actions and after receiving their training, is an ideal candidate for revolutionary action. The very experience that drives a soldier to leave is inherently radicalizing, and they've been given the skills necessary to resist the very system that trained and equipped them. There's a parallel here to the stormtrooper defectors from Andor in Rise of Skywalker, but I don't want to get into that movie. With Gorn, we get a little bit more background. His radicalization came because of the Empire's persecution of the people of Aldhani, in his case losing a loved one to the Empire. There are many paths to disillusionment and resistance, and witnessing firsthand the inhumanity of a system you're part of is a common theme among defectors. Together, they form an essential component of the rebel forces, without which the mission couldn't have ever been conceived, let alone successfully executed. There's often a knee-jerk suspicion of veterans among the revolutionary-minded, but pushing them away when they have legitimately embraced revolutionary ideals simply robs the movement of someone with useful skills. Andor demonstrates this quite subtly. Finally, there's Cinta Kaz, who we don't get much background on. She seems to be in a relationship with Vel, but as she will say explicitly in Act 3, she puts the revolution first. She is, to borrow a phrase from Battlestar Galactica, a razor, someone utterly dependable, who has set aside their fear and doubt and utterly committed themselves to their duty. Cassian will, in time, become very much like Cinta. As we see in Rogue One, he's fully committed to the rebellion, even doing things that he finds awful. The operation on Aldhani is, in theory, about stealing funds to go to the revolution. The show begins to focus on Luthien and his benefactor Mon Mothma, who we know will eventually become a central figure in the revolution. She's funneling money to the rebels, while Luthien makes sure it gets to those in need. But while the funds are without a doubt useful to the cause, even more so, the point appears to be a public and direct assault on Imperial authority, by challenging the Imperium directly and winning a victory. Even at the cost of most of their team, the rebels are engaged in what anarchists would call the propaganda of the deed. This concept comes from the anarchist thinker Mikhail Bakunin, who wrote, "We must spread our principles, not with words, but with deeds. for this is the most popular, the most potent, and the most irresistible form of propaganda, and centers around the idea that while radical talk is fleeting, action is much more concrete, and that through the process of making direct action against the systems and oppressors, that the ideas of revolution spread and convince more through just words alone. While this is a somewhat controversial topic in leftist circles, the debate is mostly about the nature of unstructured acts of resistance, on whether collectivist action or individual action is more important. There is little denial of the effectiveness of direct action over rhetoric, but there was a great deal of debate about the effectiveness of indiscriminate criminality, particularly as it might have the opposite effect of turning individuals against the revolution instead of leading more to embrace radicalism. The show very much presents the act as inspiring more action. It's easy to imagine a young Luke Skywalker hearing about the daring flight of the thieves leaving Aldhani Outpost, and imagining himself as the pilot managing to pull off a daring escape out from under the faster and better armed TIE fighter patrols. Interestingly, the debate about the propaganda of the deed has been simmering within Star Wars fiction for years, with Saw Gerrera a proponent of it, while those in the existing power structure, like Mon Mothma or Bail Organa, are opposed to it. In time, this would lead to a schism and Gerrera's partisans operating entirely separately from the rest of the rebellion. This subplot, explored across the Bad Batch, Rebels, and Rogue One, is exactly the kind of real-life conflict that revolutionary movements have to address. There is, of course, a middle path through this debate, a supportive diversity of tactics, as it is often called in left circles. Essentially, the idea is that resistance is something of a personal act, and that you should engage in the way that you are comfortable, but not denounce your fellow revolutionary for their choices, as a variety of approaches to fighting a system of oppression are often needed. In essence, Mon Mothma may not like what Saw does, but without it, she might not have the opportunity to pursue a less violent path to victory. The lives lost in her planned assaults on both Death Stars notwithstanding. We'll get back to Saw in a bit. While Cassian works with the rebels, Luthien and Mon Mothma are seen reacting to the Empire's increasingly draconian surveillance state, with both treating everyone around them as potential threats to operational security. Mon Mothma's driver is a suspected spy, and their meetings are conducted clandestinely in Luthien's antique shop. Mothma is having increasing difficulty accessing funds for the rebellion, even as Luthien is looking for the Aldhani system score to help buoy their funds. He doesn't tell Mothma about the operation, both knowing that she will oppose it and hoping that by keeping information siloed, he can protect everyone involved. The importance of infosecurity taking such a prominent role in the story is a tribute to how well thought out the show really is. Authoritarian governments of all types are obsessed with surveillance, of control of individual behavior. Knowledge is power, as they say, but these systems are only as effective as the people running them. Which brings us to the Imperial Security Bureau. Dedra Meero is the main antagonist of the show from episode 4 onward. Though she never meets Andor face to face, as noted in the previous section, it's primarily a story about systems, and Meero is the show's representative of the surveillance and policing systems that revolutions must be prepared to deal with. While Luthien has been careful not to leave a pattern in his operations, Meero is clever enough to notice that the attacks against the Empire appear to be completely random, something that would be unlikely without conscious coordination. After all, crime is rarely completely random. It has patterns. Meero is dangerous because she's able to spot patterns that others miss. But inside the ISB, we see the sort of bureaucratic infighting that makes such operations difficult to manage. Turf wars and ambition pit the ISB agents against each other, and as we know from how Imperial officers and other services are often put to death for their mistakes, this is potentially a high-stakes battle. Dedra manages to outmaneuver her rival Blevin and take control of the Ferrix investigation. The second act is obviously where Andor picks up steam. It connects the story we've seen so far to the broader events in the galaxy and delves into the people behind the rebellion and those responsible for catching them. We see the way the Empire is struggling to keep up with acts of resistance, and we see the costs of action. 4 of the 7 rebel operatives die in the Aldhani mission, with Nemik literally crushed by the weight of their deeds. His manifesto passed on to Cassian's hands, a symbolic passing of the torch. But as we see in the final moments of Episode 6, Cassian still isn't a believer. The third act is pivotal in Cassian's story. After returning home in the hopes of getting his mother to come with him and live a better life off the proceeds of his heist, she is unwilling to abandon her convictions, and she wants to stand up to the Empire. Everyone blames Cassian for the Empire's increased presence on Ferrix, and it's hard to say they're wrong. Everyone's lives got markedly worse because of something he did. So Cassian sets out on his own and discovers that escaping the indiscriminate cruelty of the Empire isn't so easy. Taking a new name and identity, he's kicking up his heels on the planet Neamos when a patrol mistakenly picks him up as part of a dissident group. Andor assumes that he can get out of the charges since there's no evidence that he did anything wrong, but a sudden change in sentencing as he goes up for judgment leads him not only to being convicted, but for 6 years of hard labor. Cassian thought that he could run from the Empire, but the truth is that the Empire, by its very nature, seeps into everything. Its corrosive touch destroying every culture, every society, every justice system, etc. This is the nature of fascism. It must control everything. And so Cassian finds himself whisked off to Narkina 5, where he's imprisoned in a floating hellhole. The entire prison is located under an ocean, and all of the floors are electrified, allowing the guards to disable prisoners at will with a shock. And Cassian isn't just going to be serving time, he has a job to help mass-produce parts for the Empire. The floor that is least efficient each day faces corporal punishment, and prisoners dying on the floor of their factory is not unheard of. The prison is incredibly revealing of the depths of the Empire's cruelty. The floor manager is another prisoner, Kino Loy, turned against his peers to enforce the quotas imposed on them by their jailers. The guards rarely interact with the prisoners, only communicating by intercom unless there's a body to remove or a new prisoner to drop. The prisoners essentially never know when they're being watched. Aesthetically, the prison is an homage to Lucas's first film, THX 1138. Stark white and dehumanizing, clean in an unnatural and soul-crushing way. The prisoners have no personal effects. They don't even get real food. Instead, they have to drink a nutrient porridge from a tube. Conceptually, it recalls the Panopticon, Jeremy Bentham's design for a prison based on a concept of perpetual surveillance. In his model, Bentham envisioned a central observatory of guards around which a circular prison was constructed with fully visible cells, allowing the guards to at any time observe any individual. He reasoned that the possibility of surveillance was enough to keep prisoners in line. The threat, essentially, of punishment, enabling them to become productive members of society, despite whatever social dysfunction got them put into prison in the first place. This is obviously deeply dystopian to a modern audience, but Bentham actually thought his system would be better for both prisoners and guards, as it would not necessitate as much direct intervention by guards, and that the public would be able to observe and ensure the guards were not violating their power. If only. Michel Foucault used the Panopticon as a metaphor in his book Discipline and Punish, using it to explain the transition from pre-modern systems of power and government to the modern, discipline-based model that informed the shift to supposedly reform-minded penal systems over the course of the 19th century. To Foucault, the Panopticon is not a real place, but a model for surveillance and control that becomes increasingly draconian as it's implemented further into society. It began with prisons, but it spread to hospitals, to schools, and eventually into the workplace. It's fitting then that Andor's prison is a giant factory, echoing both the way that industrial society increasingly monitors their workers, even today. Recall the metrics Amazon and others use to enforce brutal working conditions on their employees, such that they can't even stop to go to the bathroom without potentially risking failing at their quota. And the modern prison industrial complex's use of compelled labor. Modern prisons engage in both the employment of prisoners with good behavior to handle operational jobs, much in the same manner as Kino Loy, and often quite literally produce products that make their way into the consumer market, serving as a form of slave labor that's not only extant but legal in the United States to this very day. In the end, we discover that the game is rigged. The prisoners aren't released, they're just reassigned. Everyone is here for life, even the prisoners responsible for enforcing discipline on their fellow prisoners. It is simultaneously the death of Olaf, who was close to his supposed release date, and the discovery that the prison killed an entire floor in order to prevent word getting out that the prisoners will never be released, that causes the prisoners to resist. The outcome seems inevitable, but every system has weak points, and when exploited, the very strength of such a system can become its weakness. Just as Andor comes face to face with the Empire in its purest form, a faceless system of exploitation that consumes sentient life to create objects and machines of value to a small elite, we also see the tendrils of the Empire continuing to creep further across the former Republic. As Luthen puts it,
"The Empire has been choking us so slowly we're starting not to notice. The time has come to force their hand."
increasingly draconian surveillance and criminal punishment in a supposedly free society is a sign of democratic norms weakening, and the Empire, still a few years out from the full dissolution of the Senate, is advancing along this path. Again, we are seeing the systems rather than simply seeing how the Empire is bad with mustache-twirling cruelty. This is a grounded, rational cruelty, and one far closer to the society we live in than most are comfortable confronting. Andor may be in a prison, but the prison is spreading to encompass everything. Vel even says as much when visiting Mon Mothma, reflecting on her circumstances and double life.
"You're one to worry about. Trapped here, boxed in.
Please tell me you're being careful."
Things are happening.
Indeed, Mon Mothma's activities laundered money for the rebellion, which she thought were safe from Imperial observation, have become suddenly only a matter of search away from detection. She is confronted by the need to deal with unscrupulous people, criminals, in order to cover up her work. Her idealistic hands, it seems, must become sullied eventually. Here again, we see the essential role that criminals play in the successful prosecution of rebellion. Regardless of their morality, their skills speak for themselves. While Mon Mothma deals with the challenge to her morality, Luthen is busy, having long since discarded his in favor of a pragmatic view that puts the mission before anything else. Hoping to build on the success of the Eldani raid and highlight the strategic weakness of the overspread Empire's forces, he visits with Saw Gerrera, hoping to bring him into the fold. As he sees it, the moment for the rebellion to come together and act is now, and he notes,
"We need the Empire to help. We need them angry. We need them coming down hard. Oppression breeds rebellion."
and the theme of conflict within revolutionary movements is hardly a new concept. There are countless examples, from the divisions in Russia during and after the Bolshevik Revolution to the bloodletting that followed the Iranian Revolution. Saul remains, in my opinion, the most fascinating player in the galaxy far, far away, a very real and flawed man played with absolute perfection by Forrest Whitaker. This depiction helps us to further understand Saw's increasingly unstable and paranoid behavior by the time of his death on Jedha. It should be noted that this is not long after he gave up his surrogate daughter, Jyn Erso, for fear that she might be used against the cause if her identity ever became known. Saw, who's been fighting since the Separatists first invaded his homeworld and hasn't taken a break since, in some 18 years, is not interested in joining a broader alliance. He doesn't trust the other rebel factions. Luthen asks him to work with the Separatist group, and Saw scoffs. It's here in this interaction that we see Andor at its most consciously political. Luthen understands, as he believes the others do not, the necessity of not just resistance but organization. He envisions using the Empire's strength against itself, baiting them into revealing their true nature, and in doing so, multiplying the resistance. Saw, however, is still invested in ideology, which he prioritizes over the pursuit of the next step, challenging the actual system that he is fighting. Saw is, in point of fact, very much like the illegalist anarchists of their time. Only a year earlier, his cell committed a mass murder in order to assassinate the governor of Inusagi. He is fully invested in the propaganda of the deed, and living the revolution in his every act of defiance. As Saw says,
"I am the only one with clarity of purpose."
To which Luthen responds,
"Well, anarchy is a seductive concept. A bit of a luxury, I'd argue, to a man who's hiding in cold caves and begging for spare parts."
The two part ways without resolution. Meanwhile, Dedra is relentlessly hunting for the rebel cell she believes is responsible for Aldhani. Tracing what little breadcrumbs Luthen's influence has left behind, she begins to focus on Ferrix as a focal point of her investigation. Luthen made himself vulnerable by going there and meeting Andor directly, and it's enough for her to run with. She interrogates Cyril and finds confirmation of her suspicions in the description of his second person with Cassian. But he has no way of identifying the mystery man, so she casts him aside, despite his cloying desire to be involved. They are both true believers too, though in a statist concept of order at any price, as Cyril says himself, instead of a concept of individual freedom. But she's too focused on her mission to pay any mind to his potential utility. She continues on to Ferrix, tracking down the known associates of Cassian to harass and threaten. Bix is taken captive to the local hotel and tortured extensively for information that generally she does not have, but which Dedra desperately needs. Cassian's mother is left alone, only that she might serve as bait to draw her son back, the ISB remarkably unaware that Cassian is in fact already in Imperial custody under an assumed name. Here again is a multi-layered bit of world building. Bix isn't just tortured, but afflicted by the death cries of the children of an alien species that the Empire exterminated. Their regime is so comfortable with its own atrocities that they weaponize them against the people that they haven't yet exterminated. The Imperial presence on Ferrix is straining the peace. The Imperials feel emboldened by the increasingly draconian policies coming from their government. The system is performing just as Luthen expected. It's only a matter of time, then, until a spark ignites the tinder of Ferrix's working class. The final act sees the last of the dominoes the show has been methodically setting up put into place. Luthen is working behind the scenes to put together an alliance of rebel groups. Cassian is learning the value of collective action for the first time. Mon Mothma is compromising on her ideals. The people of Ferrix are bristling under the brutal new order, and the ISB are tightening their fists. Cassian is burdened by the knowledge that his prison is a death sentence and finds himself convincing Kino to help him lead an uprising. As Cassian says,
"I'd rather die trying to take them down than die giving them what they want."
Kino is initially resistant, but Cassian tells the other prisoners the truth about the prison, and reluctantly, Kino hatches a plan to escape. The prisoners are frightened, but Cassian finds himself in the moment taking a leadership role, telling another prisoner who is feeling fatalistic,
"Don't die till you put up a fight."
Something that neatly foreshadows Cassian's eventual sacrifice in Rogue One. They use the prison's reliance on technological systems rather than human guards against it, flooding the factory floors so that the floor systems short out when fired. The tension in this scene is immaculate. Despite the fact that we know Cassian survives to escape to Narkina 5, the methodical way the show holds its shots as the moment of uprising gets closer and closer. A dripping wet Cassian standing in the back of the floor, hoping the complacent and understaffed guards don't notice the water slowly entering the room. This is Star Wars done with an incredibly deft hand. Obviously, the cinematography isn't the main focus of this essay, but I just wanted to note that One Way Out is a transcendently amazing episode of television on every level, and it bears repeating. And so, the prisoners advance. Some die in their attempt, but the guards are understaffed, and the system lacks fail-safes to ensure that once the uprising has reached the upper levels, that they would be able to stop them.
"You shouldn't be here,"
is the understatement of the century. And so the prison falls. The prisoners take their shot at freedom, collectively fleeing to dive into the ocean. In a final moment of tragedy, the earnest Kino, who only ever wanted to be released, can't go into the water. As it turns out, he can't swim. Ending a triumphant episode with these contrasting images, the victorious prisoners diving off, and Andor saying, "Whatever happens now, we made it," and Kino coming to terms to what he knew would be a dead end for him. It's heartbreaking and real. Even a successful revolution claims the lives of countless people who hoped that they would see freedom. And this revolution is just beginning. Meanwhile, in the ISB, one of the supervisors, Lonnie, is, as it turns out, a source for Luthen. Lonnie comes to Luthen with a warning about the impending failure of Krieger's raid on Spellhouse. He also wants out. He can't take the stress of spying any longer. But as Luthen makes a point of discussing the man's family, he makes it clear that there's no backing out. Lonnie is in for good now, and he's important. More important than 50 lives, and he just might be. Having eyes inside the ISB is of incredible value. Luthen can ensure that the Empire gets the wrong impression by manipulating the information they're getting. As he notes about the investigation into Ferrix, Dedra is wasting time while he's several steps ahead. It is in this scene that we get the most consequential dialogue of the entire series. Lonnie is pained by what Luthen is now compelling him to do, and asks him what he sacrifices since he's willing to have others sacrifice so much. And in this, we get a window into the psychology of the man who is the founder of the actual Rebel Alliance. Luthen's answer is a cold, hard look at what Huey Newton would call revolutionary suicide.
Calm. Kindness, kinship. Love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, they set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything!
His loss, his acceptance of the path that he chose, his anger. Luthen is a man who has looked into the abyss, and he understands it and knows it will consume him. But he resolves to dedicate every moment that he still breathes to fight, to make sure that his death is not one of despair but of triumphant defiance. This is the essence of the revolutionary act, of committing to give it all to see something realized. Star Wars has never been so evocative, or so timely. Luthen returns to Saw, who's decided to provide air support for Krieger's raid. Saw quickly puts together that in order to have advanced knowledge about the trap Krieger is running into, he must have inside sources in the ISB, or actually be part of the ISB himself. Seeing his pragmatic acceptance of the cost of keeping a mole, Saw understands how serious Luthen is about the rebellion, and together they acknowledge it is time to open war. We soon see what Luthen looks like at war, destroying an Imperial Navy ship's tractor beam and TIE fighters before jumping into hyperspace. Mon Mothma, meanwhile, is out of the loop of the broader rebellion forming, instead having to come to terms with her vulnerability, to the point of considering the introduction of her daughter to the child of the gangster she would be doing business with to potentially set up a marriage. She feels, as her potential future relative points out, like she's being sullied by using his services, and in her own eyes, she is. She uses the surveillance she knows is occurring to plant justification for unusual financial transactions and pin it on her husband. And in the end, we see the two children meeting and her acceptance of the one path forward. And so the first dominoes fall. Marva Andor dies, bringing all the main players outside of Mothma into the same place. Dedra knows that Cassian is unlikely to miss his mother's funeral, so she and her guard head to Ferrix to take charge of the occupation. They hope to create a trap using Rick's Road, the site of Cassian's father's death, and where his mother's remains will be interred, as the site of a captured mission. Dedra emphasizes that Cassian must be taken alive. They give the mourners leeway and make it seem like their presence is relaxed, hoping to make Andor feel comfortable and show himself. Cassian hears of his mother's death and immediately, let's be honest, foolishly, heads back home to see the funeral. Luthen is probably not wrong to want this guy assassinated. He's already been arrested once and only through sheer luck wasn't identified. Now he runs right back into a heavily policed Imperial territory where they're actively looking for him. Still, he has loyal friends left here. Brasso conveys his mother's final message to him.
Tell him none of this is his fault. It was already burning. He's just the first spark of the fire. tell him he knows everything he needs to know and feels everything he needs to feel. And when the day comes that those two pull together, he will be an unstoppable force for good.
The show is explicitly telling us that the revolution is a result of circumstances, of larger forces colliding, and that while Cassian feels responsible for what has happened, the truth is that it was inevitable. He learns of Bix's imprisonment and decides to use the funeral as an opportunity to break her out. Luthen joins Cinta and Vel, also hoping to find Cassian that they might silence him before he falls into Imperial hands. It's an odd move for someone willing to kill to hide his identity to show up in the place he knows the Imperial security forces will be, but then Luthen seems to understand his anonymity well enough to assume that no one will take a second look at him unless Andor could ID him first. And bringing up the rear, there's Cyril, who was informed of Marva's death by the security officer he partnered with in Act 1 to attempt to apprehend Andor. They have no authority on Ferrix anymore, but they think helping catch Cassian will clear their names of responsibility for the disaster. And the rest of the dominoes fall. Cassian is nowhere to be found, gone as he has to break Bix out using the tunnels the locals know well, but the Imperials are unaware of. The people of Ferrix, originally granted a permit for 40 mourners, show up in force, and Marva, as a final act of defiance against the Empire, uses her farewell message as a call to action.
The Empire is a disease that thrives in darkness. It is never more alive than when we sleep. It's easy for the dead to tell you to fight, and maybe it's true, maybe fighting's useless. Perhaps it's too late. But I'll tell you this. If I could do it again, I'd wake up early and be fighting.
And so the fight begins. One of the Imperials attempts to silence Marva's droid, and Brasso bludgeons him in the head with her funerary stone. The image of him holding her remains, her essence in his hands, and using it as a cudgel against the forces of oppression. My God, the beauty of that moment. Marva's final act of defiance to become a literal weapon. We should all be so lucky. I want everyone to note that if possible, I would like my remains made into a weapon to fight oppression, whatever that looks like. The imagery of the uprising on Ferrix is hauntingly similar to the images of riot cops confronting protesters on the streets of American cities only a few short years ago. The escalation as the fighting starts to turn, bombs thrown, stormtroopers firing weapons free into the crowd, Dedra bruised and bloodied from the explosion, and then a rock thrown by one of the protesters. Cyril finds his moment to be of use, saving her from a likely slow end crushed to death under the people she was attempting to put down. The fleeing mourners make their way home, bloodied from the fight, smoke still rising from Rick's Road. Cassian gets Bix off-world, but stays behind to find Luthen. He's ready now, either to die or take his place in the fight. It was, after all, what his mother would have wanted. And so Andor Season 1 ends. Cassian has joined the cause. Luthen has a new and capable tool to wield in his war. Ferrix, the true main character of the first season, is in a state of chaos. Undoubtedly, there are other planets throughout the Empire experiencing the exact same defiance and willingness to fight, as Luthen predicted. We know that at this exact time, Lothal is roiling over the Imperial intrusion into their planet. The Empire is flexing its muscles and finding resistance a constant problem. What's so remarkable about this series is, despite the incredibly grounded, granular world building we see throughout, the way it completely blends the elements of Star Wars in, the aesthetics, the feeling, while also being completely different in its pacing and story. It's a bit like the Star Wars Visions anthology series. It's aesthetically similar to Star Wars, but it's something else entirely. Musically, the show has one of the best scores I've heard in ages. It's such a stark contrast to the John Williams themes that we're all accustomed to in Star Wars, and which I love in their own way, of course. But this is infused with a feeling that I can only describe as channeling Blade Runner's iconic score by Vangelis. Nicholas Britell does a remarkable job with the show, and I found myself listening to the soundtrack while I write this piece. It's good inspiration while not being distracting like watching a full episode would be. In a related matter, I've talked in the past about the way inspiration works in media and how different influences combine, so it's quite lovely to experience a Star Wars story that feels almost cyberpunk in its themes, some of its aesthetics, and even in its musical tone. Star Wars as a space opera was quite different from the cyberpunk genre that would emerge only a few years after it would come out. But Star Wars was a major influence on some of the aesthetics of cyberpunk, the idea of incredibly futuristic technology that looks worn down, old, mundane, the way our tech looks. That was a major part of what made the effects in Star Wars work so well, and it was part of what grounded the somewhat fantastical elements of cyberpunk stories as well, whether it's literal grime or metaphorical. And importing the sort of low fantasy characterized by cyberpunk, a gritty realism, Andor completes the journey, bringing Star Wars subtext to text, transforming the narrative from mythological to materialist, the fantastical to the relevant in the here and now. And there we have it. I've managed to write something like 10,000 words about this show in a matter of a few days, so that hopefully gives an impression of how much I appreciate what this show is. Star Wars doesn't have to be brainless pulp, regardless of what J.J. Abrams thinks people want. And in Andor, we have the equivalent of 4 films worth of material handling the universe with both reverence and inspiration, creating a world that feels so much more visceral thanks to the methodical storytelling. So, yes, some people found the beginning of Andor boring. But if you watch it focusing not simply on Cassian, but on the way it shows us the systems in play, the way it reflects our world, you may find it has a lot to say. One woman's opinion. And that's going to do it for this episode. Thanks so much to my patrons. You all make this show possible. I couldn't afford the software I edit these things on without your contributions. And as always, if you're interested in joining the Patreon, for as little as $2 a month, you can help me make more shows like this. And I'm definitely going to want to do a bit more Star Wars related content. One of the things I'm potentially going to work on is maybe some stuff with Rebels. I don't know. We'll see. And of course, there is also a podcast, my show about Necromunda, the Dome Runners. Check that out on iTunes, Google Play, etc. And of course, as always, everybody watching, stay safe and, well, if you paint, don't forget to change your paint water.